Hello AP World. Let's finish up our discussion on the Indian subcontinent. We already discussed the Harappan societies, so let's now talk about the Aryan migrations. So Aryan refers to a language group. Many people of European descent also speak a similar type of language. So the Aryans migrated from Eurasia starting in around 1750 BC. So that's interesting to us because that's overlapping with the decline of the Harappan civilization. So we could surmise that maybe some of the reasons why the Harappan society declined was because of the influx of this new outside population. Aryans were more pastoral, not so much agricultural. So they grazed cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, larger animals that were indigenous to Eurasia. They did adapt agriculture as they migrated south, and this is often a sign that the Aryans and the Dravidians, who had already existed in India, did collaborate. They also clashed, but the Aryans most likely would not have picked up farming if it wasn't for some sort of interaction that was peaceful. Also, as a side note, as far as Hinduism is concerned, the cow is not yet sacred. So when I say that they're grazing these animals, that they're pastoral, they're also clearly slaughtering them for food. One element of culture that's very popular to discuss among the Aryans is the Veda. The Vedas are essentially their poems, their hymns, their ancient sacred texts. They're very illustrative in nature as well. And they are indicative first of the spiritual nature of the Aryan civilization. We're not going to reserve a conversation about religion here. Again, I'm going to clump that up later, but the Vedas do give us a sense of the significance of religion, also the significance of written language. Rig Veda, which is the most famous of the Vedas, was written sometime between 1400 and 900 BCE. So it shows us that writing developed very early in the Indian subcontinent. And again, remember from the last video, I said that that little sample of script that I had on that slide, that dated back to around 3300 BCE. So writing was not by any means new when the Vedas came out. It just shows us that because writing was already popular, that these works that really demonstrate sophisticated culture are coming out around these times. So the Aryans, they do. I didn't realize. I'll just discuss the Aryans. There's no final slide here, and China will be in a future video. We know that the Aryans were complicated in terms of their social interactions. So, for example, they would sometimes clash with other societies that already lived in India, like the Dravidians. So I just said that, the Dravidians would maybe teach the Aryans how to farm, but at the same time, they would sometimes fight. So it's a very ancient society, and there isn't necessarily sort of a formal agreement. There's no such thing as a peace treaty. So these things happen. So again, this relationship between the Dravidians and the Aryans was probably pretty complex. In a lot of ways, it sort of reminds me of the way the European settlers in the New World sort of interacted with the Indians or Native Americans in the early periods of contact. They clearly traded, but then there were other times when these populations clashed or things could result very violently. So also the Aryans conflicted with themselves. There was no centralized government that existed. It was more of a series of smaller chiefdoms. So that meant, and also these societies are very patriarchal. So that means that there's a lot of conflict locally from one chiefdom to another. Now these chiefs, so to speak, were called Rajas. Raj is I believe, a Hindi word for king. But what you're also going to see is that the Aryans, despite the clashes either with other civilizations or with themselves, the Aryans continue to grow in population, and they do actually spread out all the way to the Ganges River Valley. So you start to see the Aryan population actually spread out to this area, right? So again, we have very large cities that are going to be established throughout all these river valleys as time goes on. You're also going to see some civilizations spread even farther down the subcontinent, but at least in the early periods of the Indus River Valley civilizations, we tend to talk more about the northern part of the continent. But of course, as time goes on, we'll talk about how it consolidates during various empires. And the caste system, we discussed that in class, so I'm not going to elaborate on that much. We know that as far as the vocabulary is concerned, we don't have to be too worried about that, just so long as we can describe who is in which category and why that matters. And one more thing I wanted to say about the caste system. In class, of course, we mentioned the untouchables, which we knew about already. But also we were talking about social mobility, and it's important to emphasize that the caste system that existed in India before British contact was not nearly as strict and rigid as the caste system that existed afterwards. So that meant, hypothetically, if you were a merchant, but you ended up joining the ranks of the military, therefore you moved up in the caste system, that could happen. It was easier to happen before British contact. The British essentially adopted the caste system in their own way, first off, because it was somewhat similar to the hierarchical system that they had. It was just much more formal. And secondly, the British adopted it because it was their way of keeping themselves at the top and keeping all of their Indian subjects below them. So that's really a watered down explanation behind the caste system. But again, as far as the breakdown and the pyramid is concerned, we're not going to recreate that here. So thank you. That is our discussion on the Indus River Valley. And again, stay tuned for a comparative religion video that will come up most likely after the China videos. And the China videos are next. Thanks, AP World. If you're not in my class and you feel like you benefit from these, as always, like and subscribe.